Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 106, and today I'm in conversation with Dr. Hugo Méndez. Hugo Méndez is Associate Professor in Ancient Mediterranean Religions at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we got together to have a chat about John's Gospel and the Johannine Community. It's a proper geek out. I hope you'll enjoy it. We begin by chatting about his forthcoming online course with Bart Ehrman's Biblical Studies Academy. That is called The New Testament, Exploring the Christian Bible. It begins on January the 27th, 2025, but you can pick it up anytime from the links in the show notes or by going to bartehrman.com/Hugo NT. And if you do sign up through my link there, you'll be supporting this podcast, which I greatly appreciate. Very warm welcome to the NT Pod, Hugo. Delighted that you could join me today.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So one of the reasons that we decided to record together today is that I've just come out of an online course on Bart Ehrman's online Biblical Studies Academy platform. It was called The Mysteries of the Synoptic Gospels. I had tons of fun doing it. I really enjoyed it. I mean, once you've got over the business of staring into a camera instead of staring at people's faces for 45 to 50 minutes, it is actually a really, really enjoyable way of engaging. So when I heard that you were going to do the next course on that same platform, I thought I'd really love to have a chat with you about it and find out what you're planning. So what's the name of the course?
Yeah, so it's the New Testament, Exploring the Christian Bible. And the idea here is that we have a 27 lecture course. It's the same course that I give to my students right 20 minutes from you at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, except that we're going to give it to an online audience too in some form and really kind of welcome everybody into my classroom.
Fantastic. So 27 classes, does that mean that there's one for each book of the New Testament?
No, it never works that way. You always kind of have to pick things. So in my case, I'm focusing on some, kind of large themes, right? But I do move through the New Testament sequentially. I still think that, in a New Testament intro, and I know people have very different philosophies of this, I think it makes sense, given the diversity of the students that I work with. You kind of have to talk about Jesus first. And, for all of the ways in which they might work over the memory of Jesus, the Gospels are still the foundational starting point for that discussion. And then, we move into the epistles because you're going to move into the life of Paul. You're going to move into the many receptions of Paul, the imitations of Paul in the case of the Deutero-Pauline literature, the Catholic epistles. And then, finish off with Revelation because it starts to feel apocalyptic at the end of the semester. So it seems about right.
Yeah, it's fun that you're doing it that way because, I have the same battle whenever I'm teaching Intro New Testament because there's part of me that thinks I should begin with Paul since, I'm sure you agree with me that the earliest works that we have, extant works that we have are the Pauline letters. But on the other hand, I actually do end up going canonical and I do start with the Gospels because I think it's, at the end of the day as well, it's an intro New Testament. It's an intro, it's not an introduction just to say Christian origins or early Christianity. You're specifically saying, what about is this particular body of works that we call the New Testament?
Yeah, that's right. And I think in my context, I have international students in my classroom who have no background potentially in Christianity. I have students who have never picked up the Bible in any form. So, narrative is also the easiest entryway, I think, into this literature, where, we know, right? Epistolary, mirror reading. These are different sorts of, frankly, more demanding ways of reading the New Testament.
And will you do work on how to do historical reading? I assume that it's mainly a historical reading. Is that fair? Not a kind of theological reading necessarily, or a spiritual or confessional reading. It's largely historical, would you say? Would that be a fair way of characterizing it?
Yeah, that's right. Historical and literary. Part of it, what I really do at the beginning of the semester in my own classroom, and I'll be doing parts of this also on the online format. At the University of North Carolina, we have to actually lay down the boundaries of how we do biblical studies in an academic setting because we, of course, are in a particularly constrained context. So, religious studies at UNC comes from the early 20th century and mid 20th century, and precisely from a desire to introduce this kind of material into our curriculum in a way that, it was offered at Duke, it was offered at Wake Forest, it was at the Harvards and Yales of the world, but we hadn't been able to offer it throughout the entirety of UNC's history because, and you kind of understand this concept even coming from the UK system, biblical studies was viewed fundamentally as a theological field. It's in that respect also a pre-professional field. So early in the semester, I have to give the kind of ground rules particular to a public secular university and the historic compromise. And I talk about where that comes from and, kind of help my students understand a little bit of why we do things the way we do, set ground rules for this discussion. And then, we transition to the literature, mostly from a historical perspective, but all throughout. I mean, I do literary criticism in the Gospel and Letters of John. I enjoy literary criticism very much. Those are the kind of, I think, two major menus.
Sure, yeah. I think, we're very much on the same kind of page on this. And, I go through those similar steps when I teach New Testament at Duke. I suppose there would be some challenges about doing it in this format because having done one of these courses, the audience is so much more diverse than you or I are going to experience here in North Carolina. And even in terms of when you look at the map of the number of people who are turning up to your class, it's wonderful. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. I had some people, I was sitting at 6 p.m. recording here, and there would be people, in Europe following along live at midnight, and then there's someone over on the other side of the world early in the morning. I absolutely love that context, and it's something that even during the pandemic, I never experienced anything quite like that for a kind of global audience. So does that mean you're going to have to adapt the way that you do this a little bit compared, say, to UNC, or is it just a kind of test it and go kind of setup?
Well, there are going to be adaptations. I mean, one of the ones that I'm looking forward to, and I'm sure I think you enjoyed, was having a Q&A session after the lecture, right? Which is something that I don't do with my students. And, when I teach this at UNC, I'll have, 240 students in my classroom, and I ask each of them to turn in 4 to 6 sentences at the end of questions and comments, and that's a daily homework assignment in all of my classes. So I get the feedback, but it's not the two-way conversation. I think the questions out of left field, the ideologically driven questions, that I think is going to be a much more fun but rich and I hopefully rewarding real experience for everyone.
No, sure. I that was very much the thing that I enjoyed most was the Q&A and just hearing people's immediate interactions with some of my own thoughts. I mean, that was quite exciting and some of the questions are quite unexpected, but all were interesting. All were good. So I suppose one of the other things that's worth mentioning, in a related context, is that you have co-authored with Bart Ehrman his introduction to the New Testament, and that's been out for what, a year or so now?
Yeah, just about.
Fantastic. And that is the 8th edition, I want to say?
Yeah, so this is the New Testament, a historical introduction to the early Christian writings with Oxford University Press. And this is the 8th edition. So this is Bart Ehrman's textbook, I think dating back to the 1990s. And I came in as now the second author for this edition. And it's kind of a passing of a baton and now a co-authorship situation within that.
That's fantastic. I mean, I loved reading it, and I've used Bart's textbook in my classes for many years, many years, and each time updating it with the next edition. But if I may say so, there was one thing that always stuck in my craw, which was his discussion of the synoptic problem, which is something I am mildly obsessed by. So I absolutely loved the rewrite in this edition. So thank you for that. That made me very happy in comparison. I mean, I actually criticized that introduction in my book, The Case Against Q, in 2002. Where I always like the first chapter of my books to be first impressions, where it's like, okay, someone coming fresh to the field, how are they going to experience the field? And so introductions to the New Testament are often a good way of testing that. But will you use that textbook in this course?
Yeah, for this course, it'll be running essentially parallel, like I'll assign readings from the book, but we've also kind of developed the course in a way that it doesn't necessarily impose the obligation of having to use the textbook. I use it in my class, certainly. And to your point about the synoptic problem, yeah. So we had a few chapters of that textbook that I rewrote, and with working with Bart on that.
Yeah.
And one of them was definitely the synoptic problem chapter. So when you write an introductory textbook, there are different philosophies one could go in with, in terms of how one would like to structure, discuss any aspect of the book within the book. So Bart's philosophy. When he set out to do that synoptic problem chapter, he did fundamentally, for everyone's reference, a two-source hypothesis chapter. That's what that is.
Yeah.
You read the chapter, you get to the end, you realize it's the two-source hypothesis. That's the winning answer to the synoptic problem. And that's partly because I think for Bart, when you do an introductory class, in his philosophy, you give the basics.
Yep.
And then you nuance with more coursework, right? So you have to kind of go to the upper division classes to realize, okay, well, what you kind of had in the first textbook is just actually something that's more complicated now. Another reason, too, is he felt very strongly in an introductory class, students get overloaded if they're not getting the answer. And, we have those kind of STEM-oriented students, right? Science, technology, engineering, math, who really want the answer, the field. And so he very much had that as a guiding philosophy. I'm a very different teacher. For one, I'm fair hypothesis, which is different.
Right. Yeah.
What? Yeah. And then fundamentally, I think I actually love debate in the introductory class. I think part of it, and I kind of tell people, is that I went to a small little fundamentalist Christian college, and we were taught how it went very straightforwardly, black and white. And the fun of New Testament studies, and the only moment this field really came alive for me, was when I realized how uncertain everything is, how contested and debated everything is. And so I think my philosophy going in is I actually want students to just realize this is an incredibly, a field with lots of vitality, lots of creativity, lots of ongoing debate. And so that chapter walks them into it. Now it's a two-source versus fair hypothesis chapter. We do kind of things like that. I rewrote the Gospel of John chapter, the Epistles of John chapter, to kind of bring out some of the more, on the one hand, updated contemporary approaches to those texts. So literary criticism of those works, in part, but then also to kind of walk students into debates over the Johannine community hypothesis, over all the things that are different on that landscape.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously one of the other issues that is very close to your heart, looking at John's Gospel and the Epistles of John. And I think it's fair to say we're both in a fairly similar place when it comes to John's Gospel. And that place is somewhat different from someone like Bart, who, for example, to take one issue of interest to me, Bart thinks that John's Gospel is independent of the Synoptic Gospels, and it would take, heaven and earth to move him from that position. I mean, we can try, but so in your case, I think you lean much more into the idea of John being familiar with the synoptics. But the thing that I think you've already been enormously successful with is really shaking the foundations of the Johannine community hypothesis. Would you care to explain, first of all, what the Johannine community is? And by that, I don't mean a collection of us people in North Carolina who love talking about John's Gospel. Could you explain what the Johannine community is? And then I would love you to walk us into why you don't really believe in it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the Johannine community hypothesis is a very compelling attempt to solve some fundamental problems we have whenever we open up the Gospel and letters of John. So, if you open up the New Testament, you've got 4 books in there that have the name John in their titles. You have the Gospel of John, and then you have, tucked towards the back, the letters of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And if the similar titles weren't enough, the contents of these particular texts would remind you that they very clearly seem to be related somehow. You'll find unique expressions in these books, things you'll find nowhere else in the New Testament, but are found precisely in these works, that are really, really, possibly indicative of some sort of connection between them, similar themes, similar ideas. These are kind of really, really well-rehearsed sorts of things, right? So one of the big fundamental questions we have in our field is, how do we make sense of the connection between these texts? The traditional explanation is that if you see a lot of similarities between these texts, then that points to a single author. And so, since antiquity, right, that has been the approach, to say that a single person wrote all four of these texts, and that person, of course, would eventually be identified with John, the son of Zebedee, probably from a very early date. What happens is that in the early 20th century, scholars look at this literature again and realize, and this is folks like C.H. Dodd, for instance, who looks at these texts and says, actually, there are subtle differences that are just as significant as the similarities. So if you read 1 John, for instance, in comparison to the gospel, you'll see this very central foregrounded theme of the antichrists, which has no anchor in the Gospel of John.
Right.
You'll find atonement language very, directly in this text that has no clear anchor in the Gospel. You'll find that even some of the idioms and expressions you saw in the Gospel are being used in subtly different ways in 1 John. And so ever since the early 20th century, the field had more or less coalesced around the idea that the Gospel must have come at least primarily from a different hand than might be responsible for one or more of the epistles. In other words, there's multiple authors in here. But there again, you get the question of, well, then how are these particular texts related, right? So if you find all of the similar expressions, dwell or abide in God, do the truth, walk in the light, that unites these texts, how do you explain that? The answer was to posit that even if these persons who wrote these texts may not be the same person, they might have been connected somehow.
Right.
They might have been integrated into a single early Christian movement or tradition. So the analogy I like to give my students is, if you hear someone say, I'm going to Mass, that word is automatically kind of a clear tell that the person is probably Catholic.
Right.
Certainly unlikely to be Southern Baptist, right? The language, the expressions we use coordinate us within individual Christian movements and traditions. And so by that analogy, when scholars in the mid-20th century are looking at similar expressions like walk in the light and dwelling and abiding in God, they imagine that there must be this stream or movement that is distinct from other streams or movements that might be represented in texts that lack these expressions, Matthew, the Pauline letters, things like that. And so they conceptualize these multiple authors as a single community, as the Johannine community in particular. That's the hypothetical, kind of label for them here. So my work has looked at this literature again and suggested that actually there's a much better way of making sense of both the similarity and the differences that we find in this literature. I think that these texts represent a chain of pseudepigrapha. So we have in the New Testament great examples of this. We have the letters of Paul, the genuine letters of Paul, and then we have the Deutero-Pauline literature, which we think are texts that were pseudonymously written in the name of Paul. If you line up these texts, there are differences between them. They're the very differences that establish for us as scholars that the author of texts like Colossians, Ephesians, 1 Timothy, Titus are not Paul himself. But there are also profound similarities because these later authors are imitating the language of Paul, presenting themselves as Paul, co-opting the persona of Paul. And my argument is that that's precisely what I think is at work in the Gospel of John and in the letters of John. There are profound similarities linguistically. There are also these differences. But what scholars have more or less overlooked in the 20th century is the authorial casts of these texts are very consistent. So if you look at the Gospel of John, in 1:14, the author positions himself as an eyewitness. You'll see this again in 1935. You'll see this in 21:24 to 25. if you open up First John, it begins right with the author claiming to have seen, to have
Hmm.
touched, to have heard
Right,
Jesus. He
right.
positions himself as an eyewitness. If you look at the gospel, you'll see that eyewitness speak in we language and I
Mm,
language
mm,
across the entire gospel. In the epistles, you have alternations of we and I language.
hmm.
And then again, in the gospel, you have this very distinctive, rich set of idioms and vocabulary. You go into the epistles, you find the same idioms, the same, if you
Yeah.
will, signs of a kind of a common idiolect, the
Hmm.
speech of an individual
Hmm.
writer. And so my argument is that there has been a very deliberate attempt to imitate the gospel and to co-opt its narrator in these
Hmm.
later texts, which then also helps us resolve some other questions about
Right,
these works. Why, for instance, are Second and Third John so widely contested by ancient Christians?
right.
When we first hear about Third John, Origen says that not all think they are genuine, Second and Third John in particular. And so my argument is that, yeah, there were these questions because ancient Christians were aware authenticity was a problem for these
Hmm.
texts.
And I suppose that's an area where you're very much, we talked a little bit about where we contrast a bit with Bart Ehrman, but I think that's probably one area where I see very much in continuity with his work because he's done such interesting work on the whole question of forgery, pseudepigraphy, and how that works in ancient texts. Is that fair to say that you're kind of, not sort of following in his footsteps a little bit, inspired by some of that work?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think my work on the, if my work on the Gospel of John has been very much, I think, inspired not least by my engagement with, your writings, et
Hmm.
cetera, thinking about literary relationships between Gospels. My work on the epistles is very much, I think, in the debt of Bart Ehrman's 2012 forgery and
Hmm.
counter
Hmm.
forgery, this
Hmm.
kind of exploration of the evidence that pseudepigraphy is a major, major component of early Christian
Hmm.
literature.
Right, yeah, and it is such an important book, that is. It helped me to rethink all sorts of things that I mean, even just the use of terminology, because
Mhm.
I'll admit I instinctively veer away from wanting to talk about forgery in antiquity. I don't have
Mhm.
any problem talking about it when it comes to 20th and 21st centuries, but somehow there's I don't know whether it's a kind of a residual traditionalism or something that makes that difficult. But I wanted to, ask the question about if John's Gospel, and I agree with you on this, but if John's Gospel is a pseudepigrapha, and if the epistles of John are pseudepigrapha, why is it so subtle? Because when you look at some really overt pseudepigraphy, early Christian pseudepigraphy in the second and third centuries, you get lines like the Gospel of Peter, I, Peter, right?
Yeah,
Gospel
sure.
of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas is like, these are the secret sayings that living Jesus spoke. And,
Mhm.
Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote them down, and Jesus whispers in Thomas's ear. I mean, it's so blatant, the authorial presence, the authorial self-representation. And of course, they're making it up. But
Yeah.
they really want the reader to be under no illusions that this is Thomas talking. This is Peter talking, or pick who you might out of those things. But John's Gospel, you're right. I mean, we've got things like "We beheld His glory" in 1:14, and we've got the presence of the witness at the cross, and he's the author. But he never says, "I, John," does he? Or he
Mhm.
never really leans into it and he doesn't tend to say, like when you're at the Last Supper in John 13, it's all about the disciple whom Jesus loves. He doesn't say, "I did this" or whatever. So I suppose if John is a pseudepigrapher, and it's a subtle pseudepigraphy, isn't it? And if so, why? Why is he not more blatant? Why is he
Yeah.
doing that?
Yeah. So I think it's fair, first of all, to remember that not all ancient pseudepigrapha, not all ancient falsely authored texts necessarily always have an overt authorial cast. And, one of the kind of easy examples, I'm Catholic, you open up a Catholic Bible, you read the Book of Wisdom, what gets titled The Wisdom of Solomon. The author never uses the name Solomon in the book.
Hmm.
But you get to chapter 9, verses 7 to 9, and he starts saying, "You have appointed me a king over your people. You have commanded to build your temple."
Hmm.
And it's very clear that the author is positioning himself, it seems, as Solomon. You're in a book that's full of proverbs and wisdom
Hmm.
sayings, and of course that would perfectly fit Solomon. And so it's not hard to see how someone could just so easily surmise from these indirect clues what the authorial cast was. Why the author himself chose to use an indirect cast is kind of a question, right? What's the purpose of it here? Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, this is kind of another example of this, the teacher or something like that. Not using a direct name, but suggesting that you might be Solomonic. I think it's fair to say that there might be different motivations for different authors. I think in the case of the gospel writer, it's possible that the author of John, and I do think that John is pseudepigraphal, right? I do think that the disciple whom Jesus loved, this construct is actually a pseudepigraphal construct.
Me too.
I think that it's possible that the author is responding to the anonymity of the gospels that came before him that he knows. So, Mark, Matthew, and Luke don't position themselves as eyewitness texts, but also don't position their authors overtly at all. They don't represent their authors overtly. So it's possible that this author felt he was somewhat constrained by that tradition in a way that potentially the authors of Thomas and Peter and some of those sorts of texts were not. I think that explains a little bit about the epistles as well. I think that coming in the wake of the gospel, and wanting to co-opt the same authorial persona, they opted for anonymity, and a kind of strategic anonymity that nonetheless also projected the idea that they were the same author. And I think that worked for them. Of course, that's not what all of the texts out there did. So it's very easy also to pick up the Apocryphon of John, the kind of type specimen of Sethian Gnostic theology. And there's a text that clearly knows the Gospel of John. There's a text that co-opts the identity of the author of John, but there's a text in which the author says he's John.
Absolutely. And it's clear it's John, son of Zebedee, not some other Johnny come lately. It's absolutely son of Zebedee.
Yeah, right. So, I think it's fair to say that all of this literature in the 2nd century that wanted to co-opt the persona of the narrator of John could do so overtly or covertly. And it just so happens the canonical texts we have all ended up choosing that anonymous route. But that was not the only route out there.
I mean, agreed. I sometimes wonder as well whether subtle pseudepigrapha actually are rhetorically more effective, because one of the things they do is they empower the reader to go, oh, I think I know who this is. You make the invitation to make the identification without doing it explicitly, and I think there's a kind of an empowering of the reader in that sense. I have a chapter. I have a forthcoming book on John called The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. And I have a chapter in there which is called The Beloved Disciple for Readers of the Synoptics, in which I argue that John is basically, the author of John's Gospel, is inviting readers of the Synoptics to make the identification with John, son of Zebedee. And actually, it's much more rhetorically effective not to say it's him. But you helped me on something here, because I first came to the view that if John was a reader of the Synoptics, then that pretty much makes the identification between John and the beloved disciple clear. But then people would say to me, when I put forward that theory, they would say, well, what about the fact that in John 21, you do get the sons of Zebedee mentioned for the first time? And I grappled with that for quite a while. And when I read your manuscript, your forthcoming book, you talked about wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiastes and so on, I thought to myself, that's exactly what the author of the fourth gospel is doing. You finally find out that after all, the author does know who the sons of Zebedee are. He doesn't have to explain them. Like usually when John introduces a new character, he goes, a certain person, Lazarus, or if it's a known character, he doesn't do that. He just plonks it in front of you. So I thought, oh yeah, it kind of works with that subtle pseudepigraphy, and it kind of titillates the reader because it puts in your mind, oh, okay, sons of Zebedee are they? And then the story is all about fishing in John 21. By the way, so you really helped me with that, but I can't remember what your position is on John 21. I'm a bit old-fashioned, and I actually quite like it as part of the gospel as a whole. Are you a kind of John 1 to 21 person, or are you a kind of John 21 is an appendix added later kind of person?
I think the momentum in our field has definitely been towards a unitary John, but I draw the line at John 20:31. I think John 21 has to be an appendix.
Okay.
And I think it's simply the only place in the gospel where there are such a wonderful, rich alignment of features that look different from the redundant endings at the end of chapter 20, the end of chapter 21, the the contradiction a little bit of, here we're going to finish all the signs of Jesus and I don't have room for any more. And now we're going to do another one, to the fact that it's at the end of a book, which is a really nice soft spot for an interpolation. Other kind of differences tie in that for me. But yeah, I'm into John 21 still being an appendix.
So is it a bit like 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, in the sense that this is, another kind of pseudepigraphical element that's bolted on to the end. So it's part of that layering, as it were, of where we begin with the gospel, we move to 21, we move to the Johannine epistles, and you've got successive people kind of building this notion of a Johannine author.
Yeah, that's right. I think good scholarship is not only destructive but constructive.
Yeah.
So, in kind of removing the need for a Johannine community and kind of hopefully pushing some of those sorts of hypotheses to the side, what then you get to look at afterward is all that you can build in its place. And I think one of the things you can build in its place is this new idea that the Johannine literature is not necessarily the works of some sect out in Asia Minor that we've reconstructed with all these features and things like that. Instead, it's a series of responses to the gospel by readers across the ideological spectrum. So you will have individuals who, like the author of chapter 21, has decided that his response to the gospel is to try to extend its voice by writing a new chapter that accomplishes some other tasks he thinks the gospel really needs. In the case of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, you have, in my view, 3 different authors who are working with 3 different projects and 3 different ways of responding to the gospel for their own agendas. The Apocryphon of John and Sethian Gnosticism, I think the Epistula Apostolorum is part of this tradition. We have apocryphal apocalypses of John that date to late antiquity. There's even a question a little bit, I think, that my work starts to open up about, are there new ways we can think about the relationship between John and Revelation, or even begin to kind of reopen questions about how these traditions interacted. So that's what I'd like to build in its place, a more expansive view of what the Johannine literature is or was, and a kind of more creative thinking about how these texts interact and are related.
I mean, I think it's really helpful with Revelation, because Revelation, in a sense, is the biggest puzzle in Johannine literature, because we've got to say it's Johannine because it actually has the name John at the beginning. And yet,
the only one that does, the only true Johannine text that we never call a Johannine text.
But for people like Bultmann, the idea that Revelation could in any way be related to the 4th gospel, given its different eschatology and its different approach and so on. But the work you're doing, it makes Revelation fit. It fits again in a historical legacy of someone who knows that. I mean, do you see Revelation as post-dating the gospel and the epistles?
Yeah, so I have a book that's coming up, The Gospel of John, A New History, with OUP, and it should, Oxford University Press, and it should be out roughly by the end of 2025. It's in production right now. And I devote my last section to Revelation and to the question of how do we possibly want to rethink this relationship between John and Revelation. One of the questions fundamentally has to do with the dating of Revelation. And you know as well as I do that the people who work on that book directly are all over the map in terms of where they would like it. Early dates, late dates, everything in between. So that's the kind of great question. I am very open to the idea that it could narrowly postdate John, the Gospel of John, at which point, there are questions to ask a little bit about whether or not it shows knowledge of the gospel. Right. I mean, certainly when you open up the language, you see the word of God, the
Mm.
testimony of
That's
Jesus
the thing, isn't
Christ,
it? Yeah.
the John language at the beginning, and it's in the framing sections, right?
Hmm.
At that point, you start to draw an analogy in your head a little bit to the Apocryphon of John, the Sethian
Hmm.
Gnostic text, and you start to think, well, all the really Johannine type things are in the framing section. You
Hmm.
need to establish right up front in a text that this text stands in a certain tradition, is Johannine, right?
Hmm.
But from there, nothing else in the text is
Right.
Johannine
Yeah.
in an
Yeah.
appreciable way, right? This is all now getting into Barbelo and all the kind
Hmm.
of,
Yeah.
cast of characters and cosmology that we associate with Sethian Gnosticism. So one of my views in the book is, we have to be cautious about this because there are so many questions around Revelation. But if it postdates the gospel, if we could
Hmm.
say that it does, then I think we should be more willing to entertain a connection than we previously have. Or, conversely, if you dated it before, maybe there's some creative thinking we have to do
Hmm.
about how the gospel might theoretically be responding to aspects of Revelation. That's not the direction that I go in, but
Hmm.
I want to leave that out there.
And I suppose for me, if you are writing a work that is kind of pitching to readers of another work, it's the opening where you really want to hit those themes. I mean, I actually think, and I argue this in my book on John, that the most synoptic chapter of John is John 1. And I think
Mhm.
it's because he wants the reader of the synoptics to feel like they're on familiar territory. So we get mention of
Mhm.
the Son of Man, we get the Spirit descending on Jesus like a dove, we get, John the Baptist can't even loosen Jesus' sandal. All of this stuff is like so synoptic. So it puts the reader at their ease. And I wonder whether that's going on with Revelation as well and Apocryphon of John. That you start by you don't hit them with the weird stuff right at the beginning. You don't hit them with the really, tough stuff. You kind of draw them in through familiar images and ways of speaking and characters and lines and things. I mean, I like what you're saying there. I think that works for me.
Yeah. And I think, half of what my work in John is trying to do is really just spark a lot of rethinking. We've
Yeah,
had
yeah.
these very state orthodoxies in our field of how this literature is supposed to be related and not. And I think one of the things that, as we're kind of talking about Bart in the background
Hmm.
here and
Hmm.
his interest in pseudepigraphy and
Hmm.
forgery really opened up for me was I think there are places where we can rethink
Hmm.
many
Hmm.
relationships between these
Yeah,
texts all over again
yeah.
if we pay more attention to things like authorial cast and literary
Hmm.
borrowing and
Hmm.
all of the sorts of elements that go into this. And when we do, we have the chance to actually build something really creative and
Hmm.
vital in the 21st century that
Yeah,
hopefully is
agreed.
more robust than what came before.
No, agreed. I mean, I've always just going back to the Johannine community again and thinking about, because I think this is something of a new paradigm that you're talking about here. And, I was brought up on the Johannine community. I think the first book I ever read on John's Gospel was Raymond Brown's The Community of the Beloved Disciple.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I've got a skeptical mindset, which, I'm kind of cursed with. And so I remember reading that book and thinking, I don't believe a word of this, but I didn't have anything to put in its place.
Mhm.
In particular, the stuff that I struggle with in the kind of Johannine community kind of scholarship is, I just don't think that we as scholars are good enough to be able to extract layers of history from literary text, if that makes sense. So, I mean, clearly, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but clearly there is some kind of, whether you want to call it a community or not, there's definitely more than one person involved in the creation of something like John's Gospel and the epistles of John. But our ability to precisely extract the historical location and the cultural location and the theological location and even like the geographical location of these people, I just don't think that the texts want to yield up that information. They're not designed to. They're
Mhm.
not archaeological tells. And so that's one of the reasons that I kind of enjoy your work and where I think it sort of resonates with me is because I think, like me, you don't really ultimately see literary works as the same things as archaeological tells. But lots of scholars that think they are. They think they can go down layer by layer and reconstruct a community, for example. Is that fair or am I overreading?
I mean, I would say that my scholarship hopefully is trying to get the field to leave more options on the table than we have. So one of my great criticisms of the Johannine community hypothesis, is not that it's not a plausible option. So you could even have theoretically four pseudepigraphal authors who are actually just working side by side, living next door. I mean, there's nothing that prevents that. But what happened in our field is that we constrained ourselves to that one option. We only saw local network of writers who are shaped in even common congregations, when nothing said that these authors couldn't be linked literarily, that they couldn't just be people who have received the Gospel of John hundreds of miles away and who have thought, actually, I could respond here from where I am. And because we limited them to one location, one context, I think we have been more prone to ignore some of the diversity of these authors. I think when I look at 1 John, I am seeing a different sort of theological synthesis in parts than I see from the author of the Gospel of John. And rather than map that around the development of one community, my scholarship is trying to open up the possibility that this might actually represent multiple movements, positionalities, currents in early Christianity. So I think leaving more options on the table is important. Leaving more options too chronologically, right? So 2nd and 3rd John don't enter the historical record until at least the late 2nd century. When they do, they are widely questioned in terms of their authenticity. They have a very different reception history than the Gospel of John and 1 John. The idea that these are all packaged together, packaged together, all written around the same time within, just a couple years of each other and transmitted by the exact same local group, I don't think does as much justice to the very different reception histories, the very different circulation histories and questions that surrounded them. So I like the idea of leaving more options on the table. We can continue the exercise of trying to piece together clues about where these texts came from. But I think my version of caution is simply to say, but please don't start off with your conclusion. Please let these texts be these texts and find different possible contexts.
I often say something similar in relation to the study of the synoptic problem. I suppose we were touching on this a bit earlier on, that one of my biggest problems with the way that the synoptic problem is often done is that it is simply presented as, here's the solution to the problem, and then you end up refracting all the data through the solution. Instead,
circularity.
And to me, it's just so much more exciting to say, here's the problem. And you might come to a different solution to the one that I come to, but here's the problem. But can I just do devil's advocate on the Johannine community? Because, look, I mean, obviously there's a danger that, this is a bit of a love fest because I like your work. You seem to like my work, for which many thanks. And therefore we're kind of, oh, yes, and I agree with you on this. If we'd got somebody else in this podcast, let's say our colleague and friend Joel Marcus, or even Bart Ehrman for that matter, I know that the kind of thing that impresses them about the Johannine community hypothesis is things like the idea that people in the future will be cast out of the synagogue, which is a repeated theme in John. In the blind man story in John 9, it's a really key part of that story. And, Louis Martin thought that chapter was absolutely a drama on two levels. And one of the levels the drama is on is this is telling you the story of people who feel that they've been cast out of the synagogue. And then Jesus prophesies it in chapter 16. So, people like Raymond Brown, Lou Martin, our colleagues that believe this, they really feel that when you're reading John, you can't help but see that second level drama of a community that's going through its kind of crisis of identity, which would also then explain all sorts of other features in the gospel, like the hostility to the Judaioi, whoever they're supposed to be. I mean, so how do you have something good to put in place for those people that really lean into the exclusion from the synagogue stuff?
Yeah, I think my response, so a little bit to kind of maybe key in the audience here. So Mark and I work 20 minutes apart. UNC Chapel Hill and Duke are, in this kind of very symbiotic, close relationship and proximity. And so Joel, Bart, I mean, we have debates going back years between all of us. I think, I've had this conversation with Joel, and I've had this conversation, with other people. So when you look at as by way of basic background, right? In John 16, Jesus says that some of you will be cast out of synagogues.
Right.
He predicts that for his
Yeah.
followers. And so the argument, right, is that, well, if Jesus is predicting it, then it must be that this text was written somewhere where this had actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore this must be a feature of the Johannine community's experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of those places where you have to ask the question, but do we know that?
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't reports of synagogue expulsion 500 miles away, 100 miles away, 50 miles away
Mm-hmm.
have somehow informed the author's belief that, for instance, synagogue expulsion is a real thing and needs to be brought into this gospel?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that it has to be in the author's own local context is an assumption. And I think it's one that doesn't necessarily have evidence behind it. It's one that we make as kind of a leap of faith there.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think what the Johannine community hypothesis does somewhat subtly is it constrains our options. It
Mm-hmm.
forces us into this narrow frame where we can only imagine one place where the synagogue expulsion must have occurred,
Mm-hmm.
rather than recognizing that, in fact, Christian communities are connected. They're hearing news, they're sending emissaries, they're getting texts from other places. And yeah, they might be hearing about these sorts of things, and it might be shaping their views and experience, even if it's not directly affecting them.
And I suppose one of the things that I like to point out, which nobody ever seems to notice, is that John can also have got the idea from reading the synoptics that the first major story in Luke's gospel is Jesus being cast out of the synagogue in Nazareth, in his hometown. And you get into the Beatitudes in Luke 6, and he says, "Blessed are those who where your name is cast out as evil." I mean, so at least a text that I think that John knows and uses has got the same motif. For some reason, we've pinned this on John exclusively. I suppose it's just such a strong theme in John, but I mean, I suppose where I appreciate your work on this is that I think, because it just seems not historically plausible to me, this idea of really isolated communities. I mean, the idea that, no one's talking to one another, that texts don't flow from one community to another. And of course, this has got a legacy now of a good generation or so. I mean, I don't know if it was important to you, but an important book in my thinking was Richard Baucham's Gospels for All Christians. I mean, lots of stuff in that book I don't agree with, but I think it really made me rethink this idea, not just for John, but for other Gospels as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, so that book in 1998 definitely is part of this questioning of the community construct. I think what's happened a little bit in the aftermath of that book, though, is I think the idea of synoptic communities have been largely discarded. But the Johannine community, and I say this all the time, is a different sort of animal.
Yeah.
It has to be. It has to be because of the existence of the epistles. We have to explain how multiple authors could somehow be writing in this very closely connected way. And so, the idea that there's a community has made sense still to a lot of Johannine scholars, let alone when you read the epistles themselves and they're talking about houses and churches that are connected by emissaries, all of which seem to be familiar with Johannine language. It was still a very natural assumption for us. So, in some ways, Baucham's book was great at, I think, raising questions about communities broadly, and it still hasn't impressed most Johannine scholars, in part because you have to still do something with what the epistles are doing. And so that's kind of where pseudepigraphy, in my mind, is that other option, is the other way of maybe making sense of this. I think what's very telling is that if you read books by Baucham and by other people who fall into the gospel for all Christians kind of lineage, and you ask them, well, how are the gospel and epistles related? Those books, including by Baucham himself, will say common authorship. They'll go back to common authorship as the only explanation for how the four texts are related that we now call Johannine literature. And that's where I have a real problem. I think what the early 20th century gave us in terms of seeing multiple authors in this collection is still a very vital insight we need to be building upon, not simply pretending that okay, well, if we can't use a 20th century explanation, we have to go back to a 2nd century explanation.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful. And do you, I know some people, if they would see their origins of questioning communities Stan Stowers rather than Richard Bauckham, are very different kinds of scholars. But for me, I think both of them have helped me to question the hypothesis. But you nailed it with the Johannine community, though, because I think you're right that it's there's a sort of stubborn resilience there of that piece. I look forward to seeing actually how people respond to your work. Remind us of the title of, we've got 2 forthcoming books to look forward to from you. Remind us of both titles, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, if anybody wants to get a kind of sneak peek of where those books are moving and it just has to read something right now, I have an article that was out in the Journal for the Study of the New Testament in 2020 called "Did the Johannine Community Exist?" And it's open access. So that definitely is an article you can just pull up online if you're interested in getting into some of these issues. But I have 2 books.
Sorry to interrupt, and I'll make sure that that's in the show notes too, along with links to the other material. But do carry on.
Great. Thanks. But yeah, so I have 2 books that are coming out in the next year or so. They're, in production and moving along. So this is copy editing and proofs and all that.
Right.
But one of them is The Gospel of John, A New History with Oxford University Press. And the idea behind that book is to start rethinking large things about how John emerged, what its project was, and what its ultimate influence was on so many later literatures. That's the book we've been talking about earlier. But I have a second book called The Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, Purpose, that will be coming out with Cambridge University Press. And it will be a much closer, tighter discussion of the epistles and the particular problems around them. And with it, and I'm actually really excited about that one because I'm offering a decisively new way of thinking about, I think, First John's project that I'm looking forward to kind of teasing at some point. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm happy to say to listeners that I've read the John book and it's excellent. I haven't yet read the book on the epistles, so I look forward to that very much. But I'll make sure to put the details in the show notes and encourage people to read them. I think because I've done copy edits on my book, we might end up publishing at quite similar times to one another on the John books, which would be kind of fun.
And we just had James Barker's book come out on John's use of the synoptics. 2025 is a good year for John.
Yes. And I actually just received my copy of James Barker's book. It's called Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. I received my copy just last week. I wrote a foreword for it. I think it's a super book as well. So yes, we're in a happy place, I suppose. And thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, Hugo. The other thing that I do want to mention once more before we finish is that you have your online course coming up starting really soon. I mean, people listen to this podcast at all different times, but the course is not just live, but it's also available to buy at any time after it's been it's gone through. So if someone is listening to this podcast in 5 or 10 years' time, you should still be able to find it. And let's hope that the link in the show notes will be accurate. So remind us again of the title of that course and when people can tune in.
Yeah, so the course is called The New Testament. It's available through the Biblical Studies Academy. So the New Testament, exploring the Christian Bible in particular. And so if you look at the Biblical Studies Academy, is run by Bart Ehrman, and that's there. 27 lessons. Again, as Mark said, you can find that later too. That's great.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Hugo. It's been a pleasure chatting. I could happily continue all afternoon.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really honored to be here.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Well, thanks so much to Dr. Hugo Méndez for this fascinating discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. As a reminder, his course, The New Testament, Exploring the Christian Bible, begins on January the 27th, 2025, over at the Bart Ehrman Biblical Studies Academy. You can pick it up anytime, though, from the links in the show notes, or go to bartehrman.com/HugoNT. And if you sign up for the course through my link, you'll also be supporting the NT Pod, and of course I'm very grateful for that. Oh, and by the way, go to hugomendez.com for more on Hugo's many publications and activities. Thanks again for listening to the latest NT Pod. I'll be back again with another episode, I hope really soon. Bye-bye.